Good evening, everybody. I have to say that it is a real pleasure for me to deliver this speech concerning one important part of my research in front of the audience of the Herodotus Helpline. So thank you very much, Jan, for your kind introduction. But before beginning, I wish also to thank Professor Herzog for his kind invitation to deliver my speech, and also, of course, Professor Francesca Gazzano for original selection of my paper, winner of the Doris Post Essay 2023, but also for having shared with me her knowledge and support during the past 2 years, and also, which is quite important, as you may guess, for a non-native English speaker, for having done this also in Italian. That's my proper language. I am Italian. So, today I will talk you about Cambyses' fleet, Herodotus on the first naval endeavour of the Persians and its features. And so let's begin. Okay, I just tried to make the... Okay, so as you may guess from this title, its purpose is to find and to discuss the evidence concerning the naval side of the renowned expedition of King Cambyses to Egypt, following the essential guideline of Herodotus' histories concerning the events happened on the Mediterranean front of the rising Persian Empire. Indeed, the most detailed narrative at our disposal on this episode remains that of Herodotus. Although his account primarily conveys the image of a land-based operation, Book 3 of his histories contains a few, though very significant, at least in my opinion, few hints suggesting the involvement of a naval force on Cambyses' side. My paper, therefore, undertakes a close examination as far as possible, and as much as possible, we'll see, of the relevant Herodotean passages in order to elucidate the composition of this early naval contingent, namely, that's to say, concerning its operational organization, the provenance of its crews, and also more technical details such as the typology of its ships. By reconstructing these elements, my aim is to reassess the strategic and logistical context that rendered such a naval deployment both necessary and feasible for the great king during his Egyptian campaign. And so, I'll now try to give you a closer look at the contents and the main thesis underlying them in my paper, in view of its publication. So, just to begin, in his histories, we know that Herodotus offered the earliest sustained and truly historiographical account of how the Persians gradually became acquainted with the sea between 4 and 2 generations before him, before the third quarter of the 5th century. His narrative, framed through the Greek past experience of that phenomenon of the growth of the Persian sea power, portrays this process as both historical and cultural. Briefly speaking, the overall rapid transformation of a continental empire into one which was capable of widespread and powerful maritime action, as we know of the Persian Empire in the 5th and 4th centuries. The image to be most probably associated to the Greek, mostly, or better said, that Athenian interpretation is one of a sort of parabola, like the one you can see in the current slide. A parabola strongly increasing in less than half a century, starting from the 530s, and reaching its peak with the Persian defeat of Salamis in the year 480, followed, as you see, by an alleged irreversible decline in the subsequent period. By the way, the first explicit comment on the Persians' original unfamiliarity with the sea, what elsewhere and for a long time has been labeled their supposed thalassophobia, and here you have a remarkable example from Montesquieu's Le Prix de Loi, Spirit of the Laws, the 18th century AD, appears in connection with Cyrus' subjugation of Ionia, happened, as you know, around the year 546 BC. Herodotus notes, indeed, that when the Persian army reached the western coast of Asia Minor, it could advance no farther because it lacked ships and seafaring skills at all. In his words, therefore, which are taken from History's Book 1, Chapter 143, among these Ionians, the Milesians were sheltered from the danger of Persian conquest, for they had made a treaty with Cyrus, and the islanders among them, that's to say the Aegean islanders, the Nisiotai, had nothing to fear, for the Phoenicians were not yet subjects of the Persians, nor were the Persians yet themselves shipmen. This brief passage captures what has been definitely a crucial moment. That is to say, the Persians' first encounter with the Great Sea, and, of course, the strategic stalemate that resulted from it. Indeed, their overwhelming land power could not extend by the sea, and much less across the sea or beyond it. These are old Persian expressions, at last by then in 546. For the Aegean islanders, this represented, of course, safety, but for the Persians, this was a limitation to be rapidly, if possible, overcome. But going on with this timeline you see here, after the conquest of Ionia, Caria, and Lycia in the decade 540s, the next step in Persian growth in Western Asia was the annexation of the Levantine seaboard, which was achieved only after the fall of Babylon and its empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, in 539. This brought under Persian control many peoples and cities which had been long renowned for their maritime traditions. Yet, it was only under Cambyses, the son of Cyrus and the second Persian great king, that the Persian engagement with the sea became truly operational. Around the year 526 BC, and not in 525, as is in common opinion, Cambyses launched his expedition against Egypt, a campaign that, of course, as you may guess, demanded a strict coordination of land but also maritime forces. Indeed, ships, crews, and supplies would have been strongly looked for by the imperial military command among the Mediterranean subjects, marking the first real integration of naval resources and naval objectives into Persian strategy. But before looking at more technical issues concerning the first alleged fleet, and that's a problem using the term fleet, of course, used by the Persians and its features, I thought it should be better to look closely at its context, inquiring, if possible, and when possible, the available sources. The first section of my paper is precisely devoted to this subject. Unfortunately, Herodotus' treatment of the military operations themselves is notably quite sketchy. No mention of the events of 526 BC appeared in Aeschylus' Perse or in any other Greek pre-Herodotean source, and generally speaking, also later classical authors largely followed Herodotus' outline on these, emphasizing, for example, Cambyses' supposed madness and or some features of the land campaign, while omitting all reference to naval actions. Achaemenid royal inscriptions are equally silent, unfortunately, on this topic. Egypt, referred to as Mudraya in Old Persian, first appeared in the famous Beishtuan inscription of King Darius I, but it did this simply as one of the subject lands of his empire, basically in a list. Another text, carved on an Egyptianizing famous statue of the same King Darius, found at Susa, declares, quoting directly from the Old Persian version of its inscription, "This is the statue of stone which Darius the king ordered to be made in Egypt, so that whoever sees it in time to come will know that the Persian man holds Egypt." Yet no information is given there at all about Cambyses' conquest. Anyway, since no royal inscriptions from Cambyses' reign do survive at our day, this silence is unsurprising. But Egyptian sources, too, appear to shed little light. The invasion accomplished by, I'm quoting, "foreign peoples of every foreign land," quoting from an inscription we'll see later, surely left a deep imprint on Egyptian cultural memory, often reinterpreted through later analogies of foreign domination. We know that Egypt had different foreign dominations during antiquity. However, none of these sources mentioned any maritime operation in 526. Aramaic papyri from the Jewish garrison at Levantine in Upper Egypt, you have an instance here, written a century later than the first Persian invasion, that's to say at the end of the 5th century, refer to Cambyses' invasion only to confirm local privileges by emphasizing their oldness and nothing more. Much later, for instance, the so-called Coptic romance of Cambyses, that's to say a semi-fictional narrative coming from late antiquity, and most probably and precisely from the 7th century AD, that's to say more than a millennium after the events, basically transformed the conquest, the Persian conquest, into a moral tale, still omitting any naval dimension of it. In sum, the absence of maritime references across centuries of tradition suggests that naval activities did not feature in the overall Egyptian memory of the first Persian invasion. But this cannot mean that no naval operations occurred at all in 526. Strategically, the Persians indeed would have strongly and quickly recognized the advantages of maritime support for a campaign against Egypt, in terms, that's to say, of transport, supply, and flanking terrestrial routes towards the Nile Delta in their march. Indeed, as I've tried to show in a comparative table I've attached to my paper, here you have a reproduction of one of its pages, later attacks to Egypt led by the Persian kings in the 5th and 4th centuries always involved quite large fleets. At least according to this datum of longue durée, it is thus highly unlikely, in my opinion, that Cambyses neglected the maritime front in 526. More probably, the Egyptian fleet was inactive or already in decline at that time. In fact, Herodotus' silence on Egyptian naval resistance at the time contrasts with his detailed discussion of the Egyptian state naval achievements under pharaohs Necho II or Amasis happened in the 7th and 6th centuries, so before Persian rule, we found in a history's book 2. And this implied that by 526, the once great Egyptian fleet happened to have ceased to play any meaningful role. In my opinion, this decline can plausibly be linked to Egyptian internal situation, especially following the civic strife occurred at the beginning of the 6th century between Pharaoh Apries and his later usurper Amasis. And indeed, Herodotus gives plenty of information on this. Moreover, historically, these hard times had been followed, and we repeat what I've said in the beginning, by Egypt's increasing isolation in the Eastern Mediterranean theater. This happened indeed after Cyrus' conquest of Lydian Babylonia and the ultimate defection of Cyprus to Cambyses, but also, much later, with the famous breaking of Amasis' alliance with Polycrates, the tyrant of Samos, a figure, of course, we have to deal with in the next section. These developments must have gravely weakened the Egyptian state navy. Herodotus' mission, therefore, may accurately reflect what I called, also for a joke maybe, a phantom fleet or a phantom navy. Concretely speaking, a navy that no longer existed, that apparently didn't exist. Finally, the testimony of the famous Egyptian hieroglyphic inscription of Udjahorresnet, who was a high Egyptian official who served both under Psammetichus III, the last king of independent Egypt, but also under Cambyses and then Darius, reinforces his view. His statue, coming from Sais and now found in the Musei Vaticani, the Vatican museums, records his title as an overseer of the royal Kebenuet. I don't know if it is correctly the right pronunciation, but I hope Egyptologists won't beat me for these. Kebenuet vessels. This expression, Kebenet in the singular, apparently, usually referred in Old Egyptian, to large ships, but not necessarily of warlike use. Yet, the text on the monument made no mention of any naval engagement of his owner during the Persian invasion, as you see in his reproduction. So whether this silence conceals omission or simply reflects the reality of the events, Udjahorresnet's account aligns perfectly with Herodotus' one. That is to say, that according to both, the Egyptian navy had apparently vanished from the stage at the time of the first Persian invasion. So all things considered, we must admit again that the only proper insight into the Persian maritime dimension of this campaign comes from Herodotus. His brief allusions to Persian ships and supposedly Persian crews suggest, after all, that at least a modest and for sure hastily assembled, and that's the point I will make in the conclusion, navy had operated along with the full-bodied army in Egypt. So, to go to the second part of my presentation, to sum up, the unfolding of the events in Herodotus' account of Cambyses' campaign is quite clear. So, to have a strict backup, first of all, we're told that the king Cambyses approached with his army from the Levant and crossed the Sinai after, and that's another important point, having reached a crucial agreement with local Arabs for the army's logistics, but also for the navy's logistics. Then he dealt with King Psammetichus III in a single land battle which was fought near the easternmost mouth of the delta, the Pelusiac one, and not near the city of Pelusium, because simply the city itself didn't exist at the time of Cambyses. After that, his troops gained free access to the Nile Valley. They marched on the capital city Memphis and conquered it after a short siege. My aim now will thus be to try to give you a functional overview of the various contingents that, according to my reading of this unparalleled source, formed the navy, so supposed navy, at the time of Cambyses. And so we can begin with the Greeks coming from Asia. At the opening of Book 2, and again at the very start of Book 3, Herodotus reported that Cambyses, when he was preparing his expedition against Egypt, took with him, among his other subjects, the Greeks over whom he held sway. These Greeks were, as he specifies later, Ionians and Aeolians, namely the inhabitants of the western Anatolian polis, which had been conquered by Cyrus already in the 40s. As it stands, this information serves both to indicate the wide reach of Persian power reached by the time of Cambyses, and also, most important for us, to introduce from the Greek perspective the earliest recorded instance of a Greek participation in a Persian military campaign. However, after this brief initial mention, these East Greeks virtually disappear from Herodotus' following narrative. Indeed, when it describes the actual land battle at the Pelusic mouth, only Persians, Persei, are mentioned among the attackers, whereas, as we may understand, Greek and Carian mercenaries are said to have fought on the Pharaoh's side. We are in Book 3, chapters 11 and 12. From this selective reporting, it is plausible to infer that the Persians held command position, of course, in the army, while its rank and file comprised a, so to speak, multi-ethnic force drawn from across the empire's provinces, and we are quite acquainted with this. Think of Xerxes' campaign in Greece in 480. In fact, the Greeks reappear only after the episode of Cambyses' ill-fated Nubian expeditions, some chapters later. Accordingly, as you can read here, Herodotus states that during the king's march south, he left behind the Greeks in Egypt, and that, on his return, he dismissed them, letting them sail away, and verb used here is apoplein. We are in chapter 25. This brief statement has often been taken to imply that these Greeks served as a naval mob within Cambyses' naval mobilization. Yet, the text itself provides no explicit evidence to that fact. According to Herodotus, indeed, Cambyses merely detached the Greeks from the rest of the infantry and ordered them to remain in Lower Egypt, presumably at Memphis, while he advanced south towards Nubia with his army. Rather, so, the historian's later use of the verb apopleo, to say that the Greeks sailed away after being disbanded, indicates their mode of departure, not necessarily the function or their employment in the navy during the campaign. And it is thus reasonable, though of course highly speculative, to assume that these Greeks returned by sea to their home cities in Ionia and Aeolis. Alternatively, they may have been reassigned by Cambyses, we may think, to other Persian-controlled ports along the Mediterranean front of the empire, perhaps to carry out garrison duties, drills, or limited naval operations. But the sources provide no trace of Persian maritime activity during the last years of Cambyses' reign, nor before Darius' consolidation of his power in the following decade, in the 20s. Nevertheless, it would be quite misleading to entirely exclude the possibility that some of these Ionians and Aeolians provided their ships and manpower for Cambyses' naval effort. At last, considering the renowned maritime expertise of these same coastal communities. And thus, while the evidence allows only cautious inference, the Greeks, to some extent, also naval role in Cambyses' invasion of Egypt may represent, so to say, the embryonic stage of their integration into the Persian sea power system. Their participation in the fleet, probably limited, perhaps experimental, we have said, nonetheless foreshadows the decisive contribution that the Ionians and the Aeolians would make to the definitive creation of the Achaemenid navy happened only under Darius I. So we can now delve into a more specific case. That's the case of the ship coming from Mytilenean. The only passage, indeed, in which Herodotus explicitly mentioned Greek naval activity on the Persian side appears after the land battle. As we know, following their defeat in the eastern delta, the Egyptians retreated into Memphis to resist the invaders, the Persian invaders. In this desperate situation, Cambyses attempted to negotiate their surrender by sending them an embassy, and the herald, called generically by Herodotus a Persian man, Andrabesen, was thus transported, it as on a naus. A note that naus, of course, is the most ordinary term possible to indicate a ship in ancient Greek. So, a naus that sailed upstream the Nile, like departing from the newly conquered Pelusiac mouth. Herodotus specifies that that vessel came from Mytilenean, the chief city of the island of Lesbos in the Aegean. Although this detail is unfortunately not corroborated elsewhere, it plausibly reflects Persian control over that island already by the year 526 BC. And it is therefore reasonable to assume that the crew of that ship, of that naus, consisted mainly of Mytileneans, perhaps aided, we may think, by sailors coming from other Lesbian cities. In my opinion, this would perfectly fit the political context of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean of the time, because being unable to compete with the powerful reigning thalassocracy of Polycrates the Tyrant of Samos, started in the late 40s, the Lesbians should likely have sought Persian protection before. And so, when Cambyses prepared his Egyptian campaign around 15 years later, in the 530s, the contribution of a big ship and its crew would have been, by the Mytileneans, both a political duty and also a strong display of loyalty to their new suzerain. And we may also add that the Persian man on board that ship was probably accompanied by other Persian officers, which were responsible either for overseeing the mission or supervising the vessel. But even more interesting for us, Herodotus then recounts that the Mytilenean crew was massacred by the Egyptians, provoking, of course, Cambyses' furious retaliation after the fall of Memphis. That's a quite known episode. Accordingly, 10 Egyptians were executed for every crew member killed. We are in chapters 13 and 14 of Book 3. And as 2,000 Egyptians were put to death on that occasion, the ship's original crew would have numbered about 200 men. And that's the problem, because this figure, 200, though of course very stylized, happens to match the typical complement of a trireme in classical times. Because we know that a classical Athenian trireme in the 5th but also the 4th century, we know this from literary and epigraphic sources, plus, of course, plenty of modern literature, included around 170 rowers and about 30 officers and soldiers, or a total, of course, of about 200 men. This datum has thus led many scholars to identify the Mytilenean vessel as a proper trireme. Yet, Herodotus' use of the generic term naus suggests only a warship of notable size, and not necessarily a trireme in the later proper and Athenian sense. Thus, the Mytilenean ship, though possibly a local trireme, we may add this, may rather have been a large, visually impressive vessel chosen for its symbolic value. It was, after all, a floating emblem of Persian authority, designed primarily to awe the defenders of Memphis and to provoke their eventual surrender. Ultimately, what matters in this concrete episode is not the precise classification of the vessel as a trireme or whatever other, but that it represents, for us, the earliest documented instance of Greek naval participation in Persian service. The Mytilenean ship stood as a token of allegiance within an evolving imperial network, where display and diplomacy were always as crucial as military power in itself. And so its loss and the subsequent vengeance exacted by Cambyses on its crew highlight the complex intersections of prestige, coercion, and seaborne projection that marked the very beginnings of Persian aristocracy. By the way, another apparent exception to the limited evidence for Greek participation in the naval side of Cambyses' expedition occurs in the Samian Logos, found later in Book 3. There, indeed, Herodotus reports that shortly before 526 BC, and following a diplomatically very ambiguous exchange with Polycrates, Cambyses very readily sent back to Samos, asking Polycrates to send a fleet to aid him against Egypt. Accordingly, we read, Polycrates chose out those townsmen whom he must suspected of planning a rebellion against him, and he sent them in 40 triremes, charging Cambyses not to send the men back. Book 3, chapter 44. Such a fleet is described by Herodotus precisely as a stratos nautikos, so literally speaking a naval army, and Herodotus explicitly mentioned 40 triremes, a quite striking figure, of course, especially for the late 6th century. However, the possession of so many advanced ships of the line by Polycrates has been convincingly linked to the close Samian-Egyptian relations at the time of his rule, which may have facilitated the transfer of recent Egyptian site innovation in shipbuilding to Samos. And although Herodotus states that Samos was definitively conquered by Persia only after Polycrates' death at the start of Darius' reign, the island's early alignment with the emerging Achaemenid maritime order seems inevitable. At any rate, about the actual role of these Samian triremes in Egypt, Herodotus offered two conflicting versions of the story. Either indeed they halt on their route at Karpathos Island, and so they never reached Egypt at all, or they arrived there eventually, but they were held under Persian surveillance before escaping on. We have the two versions in the next chapter, 45. Therefore, in both cases, their overall participation to the campaign appears no more than nominal. And even if their number, 40, and their type, triremes, are exaggerated, of course, by Herodotus, these fleets in activity would have scarcely affected the campaign, given Egypt's absence of naval resistance, we have told at the beginning, and also Persia's still limited reliance on seaborne operations at this stage. But we can now move to the Levantine contingents of this first Persian navy, starting, of course, with the Phoenicians. Indeed, in light of the foregoing, and if only for geographical and logistical reasons, one may think that the very center of Cambyses' maritime mobilization must be sought in the Levant. These lands, collectively known as the lands beyond the Euphrates in the later Persian administration, were strategically vital for the new empire, because they formed the link between, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Egypt itself. Their geography, as everyone can glimpse just from a map, like the one I'm sharing in this slide, basically a coastline going quite straight from the Syrian gates in the north to Gaza in the south, favored both commerce and, of course, military logistics. The Persians quickly recognized this potential, transforming the Levant into a major staging ground for their expeditions toward Egypt and also the rest of the Mediterranean. The Phoenician cities, which had already aligned to Cyrus, thus became essential to Persian naval operations. Greek authors indeed frequently stressed that ships and that their ports, their ships and sailors usually provided the very backbone of the Achaemenid fleet in the 5th and 4th centuries. So it seems at least legitimate to suppose that when Cambyses invaded Egypt at the end of the 6th century, the Persians, lacking expertise in shipbuilding and naval warfare, relied especially on the Phoenicians, among their coastal subjects. Indeed, it was the Phoenicians that could supply most ships, most crews, and most proper and useful maritime know-how to Cambyses. But Herodotus' most relevant passage on this matter concerns Cambyses' aborted plan to attack Carthage, found after the conquest of Egypt in the same narration. This project, however, was abandoned when the Phoenicians refused, always according to Herodotus, to act against their king, the Carthaginians. We are in book 3, chapter 19, paragraph 2. The paragraph is important in this sense. So, in his words, as you can read here, Cambyses bade his fleet sail against Carthage, but the Phoenicians would not consent, for they were bound, they said, by a strict treaty and could not rightly attack their own sons. While Herodotus' depiction of the supposed Phoenician agency in this episode must be taken, of course, with much caution, as the decision not to attack Carthage was surely Cambyses' own, after all, and not the Phoenicians, the conclusion is quite clear. Thus read, in the next 2 paragraphs, that the Phoenicians, being unwilling to attack Carthage, the rest of the naval mobilization were of no account as fighters, that's to say, were of no account as naval fighters. For Cambyses would not use force with the Phoenicians, seeing that they had willingly given their help to the Persians, and the whole fleet drew its strength from them. Pas ek phoenikon erteto onautikos stratos. And that's the key to all my study, basically. The statement, indeed, establishes the Phoenicians as the primary and indispensable naval arm of the empire already in 526. And we must say that this same perception echoed through Greek historiography, where the Persian fleet is often simply called the Phoenician fleet, or the like, just like in a sort, I used to call this in this way, as of synecdoche. Be it as it may, the precise terminology used here by Herodotus is significant. That's to say, because Herodotus calls their contingent a nautikos stratos, literally again, a naval army, and that is the same phrase actually used for Polycrates' Samian fleet of 40 triremes. Both expressions, in my opinion, denote an organized and more professional and combat-ready naval force, which was distinct from other improvised or ad hoc naval groupings, which Herodotus normally and usually terms as nautica. So as it stands, we might argue that already in 526, the Phoenician fleet was not just a poetic shorthand used by Herodotus to be more clear, but the concrete foundation already of very early Persian aristocracy. But always next to the Phoenicians, however, we find also the Cypriots, of course. Immediately after his statement on the Phoenicians, Herodotus also briefly mentioned the Cypriots, with a passing sentence, you can see the relevant passage here, that unveils the traditional endeavours, because that's the best way to call it, again, in my view, of Phoenicians and Cypriots as the naval subjects par excellence of the Persian great kings. Needless to say, the island of Cyprus had for a long time been perceived as a potential strategic stronghold controlling maritime routes directed to Egypt or the Aegean. Therefore, it had inevitably attracted the interest of successive continental imperial powers already before Persian rule, Saint Egypt included. Hence, by circa 530, at the beginning of the reign of Cambyses, Cyprus came to be part of the Persian Empire. As with the Phoenician monarchies, the Cypriot city kingdoms maintained relations of both subordination, of course, but also cooperation with the Near Eastern empires, providing naval assistance to the great kings. And this naval service, and as you may guess, this definition of naval service is fundamental for this kind of work and in my research overall, chiefly consisted in placing local shipbuilding resources and local maritime expertise at the disposal of the imperial authorities, making the island's harbors the true kingpin of the typically East Mediterranean political, diplomatic, and military arrangement which has been called of suzerainty. In this light, Herodotus' statement that the islanders had given themselves voluntarily to the Persians and thus they took part in the expedition against Egypt, we found it in chapter 19, paragraph 3, fits a broader pattern already attested for the Phoenicians as we have just seen in the previous paragraph. By 526, indeed, Cypriot communities were expected to assist the Persian suzerain predominantly at sea, the rulers providing a predetermined number of ships, of rowers, and pilots for the naval needs of the empire. And whether from Greek cities such as Salamis and Paphos, or Phoenician-speaking centers like the famous Kition, all the Cypriots were bound by the same criteria of subordination to the Persian overruler, regardless of their own supposed cultural or linguistic identity. And as a matter of fact, Greek sources later record Cypriot contingents in most Persian naval operations through the 5th and 4th centuries. However, Herodotus' brief reference to their role in Cambyses' campaign offers no details at all on the size or effectiveness of their contingent. For example, later evidence coming, of course, from the time of Xerxes' invasion of Greece may only apparently provide an indicative comparison, because we know that in 480 BC, basically the Cypriots furnished 150 triremes, while the Phoenicians and the Syrians from Palestine contributed 300. So in that case, we must say that the Phoenicians supplied twice as many ships as their fellow Cypriots, according to Herodotus, thus confirming their primacy in the Achaemenid naval hierarchy. But although this ratio of 2 to 1 cannot be generalized as a fixed principle in Persian naval organization, it is reasonable to confirm what we were just saying, namely that in Cambyses' Egyptian campaign too, the bulk of the naval force was formed by the contingents coming from mainland Levant. And this is, of course, not to deny that the Cypriots participated in fair proportions to that campaign, yet this proportion was considerably smaller than their continental neighbors' one. And we can thus conclude our review by considering now the other possible components of the Levantine pattern of that alleged First Persian fleet. Indeed, the nature of all the evidence brought above suggests that the Persian call for maritime mobilization could extend also to other coastal communities found under imperial rule, besides the East Greeks or the Aegean Nesiotai, the Levantines or the Cypriots. But as it stands, conspicuously absent from Herodotus' narrative, the Egyptian campaign, is any mention of the other Persian domains on the sea, Epitalas or Tayai here if you prefer an Old Persian. That is to say, above all, those found along the southern Anatolian coast between Caria in the west and Cilicia in the east. As we anticipated, Harpagus had conquered Caria, Lycia, and likely Pamphylia already by the mid-40s, while Cilicia had most probably submitted voluntarily under Cyrus. And soon after, Cilicia, especially East Cilicia, what was classically called Kilikia Bedias, became a key base for Persian land and naval operations toward Egypt and the Aegean, serving both as a military hub and as the first stage of the maritime Levantine path, which was used for Cambyses' campaign for the first time by the Persians. And that Herodotus omits these maritime subjects from his narrative may reflect, of course, the fragmentary nature of his evidence on Cambyses' campaign. But briefly speaking, what applied to the Cypriots and the East Greeks in Herodotus' view likely held true for Cilicia and its neighbors. Indeed, it is plausible that the Cilicians had given their contributions already to Cambyses' fleet, their harbors providing logistical support to his pan-Mediterranean effort. Most probably, however, the other Anatolian maritime groups, being of course geographically and also logistically farther from the Egyptian theater, and so less relevant, at least in terms of naval service, played a minor role. Nonetheless, these regions too soon became integral to the Persian Levantine pattern of naval strategy, even if they remain quite invisible, quite phantoms, indeed, at least in Herodotus' account of 526. So far, the close inspection I have attempted at the patchy Herodotian account of Persian conquest of Egypt can definitively demonstrate that the land army of Cambyses had been accompanied also by a naval force. Therefore, the latter, the naval force, is no longer conceivable as a phantom navy, as it might appear at first glance from the sources and as we provisionally defined it at the beginning. However, and to reach a viable conclusion today at last, one issue of the utmost importance arises from all of these. Accordingly, it is an apparently quite technical one. Namely, it does concern what the structures and the organization of the naval assets that were employed by Cambyses might have been, considering the specific occasion and the general historical context. And so I'll try to give you a short glimpse on this in the remaining time of this lecture, like 5 minutes. So, as I suppose everyone has now understood, Herodotus' account of Cambyses' naval enterprise resists any simplified or uniform interpretation. In my view, the apparent unevenness of his narrative, fragmentary, scattered, and inconsistent, whatever you want, concretely reflects not negligence, but the complex improvised nature of the Persians' first maritime experiment. Indeed, Herodotus never describes a single coherent navy in Egypt. Rather, his picture evokes like a mosaic of disparate maritime contingents, like the Phoenicians, the Cypriots, the Ionians, etc. This early maritime effort stands so in striking contrast to the later, highly centralized fleets of Darius, and Xerxes and their successors. And for this reason, it should not be directly compared with them, even if, I have to say it, this has been quite the rule in previous scholarship on that subject. So, in my view at last, upon closer inspection, the Persians' dependence on Phoenician expertise, as was explicitly stated by the historian, provides the key to understanding this early stage. When Cyrus' followers first reached the Mediterranean, we repeat, at the beginning, they had, we said, to halt their march, since the Phoenicians were not yet under their sway. At the time, that's to say, the Persians had neither disposed of ships, nor of sailors, nor of naval institutions at all. But still a decade after Cyrus' conquest of Babylonia and the Levant, Cambyses' armed force remained an essentially land-based one. The campaign against Egypt, and Egypt was at last on paper, we said, a great maritime power, thus forced the Persians to rely entirely on their coastal subjects' nautical experience. And this dependence was real and not rhetorical by Herodotus. In 526, the great king could command the ports and requisition vessels along his Mediterranean front, but he lacked overall the knowledge and the infrastructure to organize or to directly control naval operations effectively. Herodotus' emphasis on the Phoenicians may, of course, we said, exaggerate their agency, but the underlying logic remains quite consistent. Persian sea power in 526 BC was little more than a patchwork of requisitioned ships. Coastal communities acted, of course, under Persian authority, but with considerable leeway, or Greek speaking if you prefer, autonomy at sea. In other words, the results of their early naval service to Cambyses were not yet the disciplined contingents of a royal imperial fleet, but mostly local squadrons which were pressed into service and gathered together education. And even the inclusion of the Samian triremes, which apparently had been requested from Polycrates, according to Herodotus, underscores this undisputably provisional arrangement. Cambyses' fleet, therefore, cannot be defined as a truly Persian navy in any strict sense. Indeed, Herodotus never uses the phrase nautikos stratos to describe a unified royal fleet, reserving the expression, we noticed, only for the Phoenicians' more organized squadron and for Polycrates' triremes. And what Cambyses gathered, what Cambyses assembled, was after all just a collection of nautica. That is to say, a collection of ships and crews which had been requisitioned from the empire's maritime provinces, from Phoenicia to Ionia and from Cyprus to Caria. And of course, there were also many various types of vessels in it, not only triremes, which were used only where they were available, but also lighter craft such as the penteconters, performing transport or also auxiliary functions. Their ownership, so to speak, was local, that's to say, in the hands of the naval subjects. Control was only nominally Persian. The endeavour was overall an ad hoc mobilization rather than a product of long-term and centralized planning. And so it was only under Darius and Xerxes that this system would evolve into a true institutional navy, namely into a properly organized nautikos stratos directly commanded by Persian officials within a structured hierarchy or chain of command descending directly from the king himself. By the beginning of the 5th century, and not in the late 6th, shipbuilding, provisioning, and naval deployment had indeed become integral parts of imperial administration, and in this sense, only later fleets can rightly be termed as the king's navies basilikoi stoloi. Cambyses' fleet, by contrast, was, at best, the result of a temporary assemblage, the embryonic stage of Persian thalassocracy, and not its realization. Also, a famous anecdote found in the histories, presenting basically a scene in which Cambyses' courtiers flattered their unstable king, perfectly underscores this. Accordingly, these flatterers declared that Cambyses had been the greatest king of all, since he had all of Cyrus' possessions and he won besides Egypt and the sea. So, in conclusion, there is a problem, of course, on these, because this alleged conquest of the sea was mostly a rhetorical boast rather than it truly alluded to the creation of a genuine naval institution by Cambyses. His victory in Egypt rests, we said, on the collapse of Scythian maritime resistance and still not properly on Persian naval mastery. Thus, to credit Cambyses as the founder of the Persian navy, as many scholars did and still do, mistakes completely the momentary requisitions of 526 for the far more structured Achaemenid sea power that only emerged 2 or 3 decades earlier. And so, while Herodotus offers no sustained description of Cambyses' maritime force, the cumulative evidence I've tried to show in Book 3 suggests, in my view, the presence of a naval component chiefly made of Phoenician Levantine contingents, but also others, serving as logistical support to the Persian land army. This assemblage cannot be considered a true nautikos stratos in the starter stance, which was only later achieved. It was, instead, an improvised maritime extension of imperial power, locally manned and only nominally Persian. But far from being, or even to be considered a phantom navy, it represented the embryonic stage of the strong sea power of the Persians on the Great Sea. The historical significance, and here stop, lies not in Herodotus' silence, but in the faint traces to which that silence can still be read. Thank you very much for your attention.